Questions that I get asked most often by PIs who are just starting out on their R01 journeys is how long is it actually going to take me to write an R01? So that's what we are talking about today. If you're new around here, my name is Sarah Dobson. I am a research grant consultant, and my team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So how long does it actually take to write an R01? The slightly annoying answer is it depends. It depends on quite a few factors. And what I really want to make clear, first of all, is that asking how long it takes is kind of a meaningless question without understanding the context that you're working within. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to identify those elements that will influence things taking longer or shorter, or really the quality of the time that you're spending on the application versus just the total number of hours that it takes. Okay, that's what we're really focusing on here. So the first thing I want you to realize is that if you're writing an R01 for the first time, you're not just writing a new type of grant. There is a lot more to it than that, right? You are also, I'm assuming that if you're writing it for the very first time, you're not particularly familiar with the guidelines and requirements and the ins and outs of how to actually write one of these grants. So familiarizing yourself with that is going to take time. If you are writing an R01 for the first time, you're also probably still reasonably early in your career still, and still, building up your program of research, which again, in and of itself takes time. You're probably also building up collaborations and leading a research team in a way that you probably haven't done before. And so if you look at each of those elements individually, each of those is a project in and of itself. And when you lump it all together, that makes the process even more challenging and time consuming, right? So the reason that I bring this up is because if you are looking to your colleagues for advice on how long is it going to take me, just keep in mind that if they are further ahead in their career than you are, the advice that they provide will be from their own perspective and their own context, having gone through that before and maybe forgotten what it was like in the beginning, right? So getting that information from them may not be as useful as you hope because of all of those contextual factors, right? And also keep in mind too that not only might it not be super helpful, it might actually be a little bit demoralizing if you realize that it's going to take you longer, or you sort of allocate the number of hours that they suggest to you, and then you hit that pretty early on in the process, right? So what we're trying to do here today is help you get a sense of what is possible for you and relate it to your own context and circumstances, rather than just taking sort of an arbitrary number of hours or number of months and working with that, right? I think that's going to make a lot more sense for you in the long run. So my best advice for you, if you're doing this for the very first time, and this is true of any grant, right? We're talking about R01s because that's the work that we specialize in here, but it's really true for any type of grant that you're writing, okay? The thing that I want you to consider, and my best advice for you here, is to just take as long as you possibly can on your first grant. There's so much to learn and so much to sort of orient yourself to, that the longer runway you give yourself, the better off and the higher quality your grant is going to be in the end. Plus, you will end up at the end of that process less likely to be completely burned to a crisp, right? So just think about that in terms of how you are planning and mapping this out. So again, the real answer is it depends in terms of how long it's actually going to take you. And that's because you're not just writing the grant, you are conceptualizing, you're meeting with others, you're incorporating feedback, you're planning, you're strategizing, you're refining. That is all part of the process. But on top of that, it's also those conditions that you are working within that are going to dictate how quickly some of that work happens, right? So what I'm going to do now is take you through some really helpful questions so that you are able to identify what you need to look at in terms of mapping this out for you. So I also recommend that if you are doing this for the first time, that you actually do your best to track how long it takes so that you have a sort of a baseline and a benchmark for yourself. It will get easier, it will get quicker, not just with one particular grant mechanism, but grant writing in general. If you are able to make it a consistent practice in your day-to-day and week-to-week career, it's not just a sort of a one-off event where you drop everything and binge write for a period of time. If you are incorporating this into your professional life on a consistent basis, that is going to make the grant writing process much more efficient and hopefully enjoyable in the long run. Okay, so all of that preface to get to some of the questions that you want to consider. The number one question that you want to consider here is, how much time do you have devoted to writing each week? How much time are you protecting each week for writing? And sub questions, do you actually use that time? So it's one thing to protect it, but are you, filling it in with other meetings that happen to come up in the meantime, or is that time actually protective, and are you using it for writing? The next question is, do you have a specific purpose for that time? Do you know what you're doing when you sit down and say, this is my writing time, I have a 60-minute block? Do you know what you're doing during that period of time? Those answers to those questions are going to help dictate the sort of level of efficiency that you're working at within that time, right? But let's try to make this example a little bit more concrete. And I'm going to pick an arbitrary number of hours, and it might take you longer than that or shorter than that, but we're just going to pick, let's say, 200 hours, okay? We're going to assume that it will take you all in to write your R01 200 hours. I certainly know of clients of mine who have taken much longer than that for their first R01s. So just bear in mind that this is a somewhat arbitrary number because we're just using it as an example to look at the difference between number of hours and quality of hours, right? So those 200 hours are not the same if they're all crammed together in a single binge writing session that happens 3 weeks before the grant is due, okay? In that case, you would be putting in 10-hour days, roughly, give or take, over the course of that 3 weeks, every single day, right? 10 hours a week, every single day, you're just writing. First of all, that is completely unrealistic. And second of all, that is going to end up the grant is just not going to be very good at the end of it, okay? So that is poor quality hours to be spending on a grant versus, let's say you have 10 hours of protected time per week to write that you actually use to write your grant, and you have a purpose for those hours in that time. So that's 10 hours a week. That's 2 hours a day during the business week, Monday to Friday, right? If that was what you actually had and actually used, it would take you 20 weeks, 5 months to write your R01, okay? So what I want you to notice is that the number of hours it's going to take you needs to be contextualized. So again, how much time do you have available? How are you using that time? Having a number of hours is meaningless unless you understand the circumstances that you're writing in. And remember too, most importantly, it's not the number of hours, it's the quality of those hours that is going to make the biggest difference. And in my view, spacing those hours out and giving yourself some breathing room, and of course, not having to drop everything else you're doing, is going to make the quality of that time that you spend on your grant much better. And in turn, it's going to improve the quality of the grant that you actually submit, right? So that is truly the number one question that you need to ask yourself is, how much time do I have protected for writing in a week? And am I actually using that time for writing? And that would be the number one thing that I would recommend that you work on and commit to as you are starting to build grant writing into your regular academic life. Other questions to consider are, how efficient of a writer are you? So, in other words, do you toggle between writing and editing? Do you start writing and then you end up down a lit search rabbit hole and you get distracted by other things? Or are you able to separate writing, in other words, just getting words down on a page and then refining them later? Ultimately, the latter example is going to help you be more efficient and get you where you want to go faster. And so that would be another thing to look at and to try to work on if you want to be a more efficient grant writer. Number three, we already sort of talked about this at the beginning, but how familiar are you with the guidelines and requirements for the R01 or for any other grant that you're working on, right? Those guidelines and requirements and the different elements of the application that you need to submit, you're going to have to factor that into the writing that you do and the assembling and the preparation that you do. And so if you're not at all familiar, those guideline documents can be mind-bogglingly difficult to figure out. So it's really important that you spend some time getting to know what is required to submit a complete application. And that's just the bare minimum, right? Submitting a complete application that doesn't get sort of kicked out of the process at the compliance stage is just the bare minimum. We're talking about grants that have a chance at success, right? So first understanding what the bare minimum requirements are is an absolute must, and then understanding the the principles of grantsmanship and really communicating the value of your research. That is another important piece of the puzzle, right? So again, that would be another question for you, is how comfortable are you with grantsmanship and what is required to clearly and persuasively communicate the value of your research? If that's new to you, it's probably going to take you a lot longer to get to that point in your grant. You might be able to get words on the page, but the quality of the communication might not be enough to give your grant a really good chance, right? Other questions to consider: how responsive are your collaborators? Are you sitting around waiting for sections from them, from contributions from them? Are you sitting around waiting for feedback from them, right? The next question related to that is, who else do you have who's going to give you feedback on your application? Are they reliable in terms of being able to say, I'm going to give you a heads up that I'm going to send you a section of my grant in 3 weeks. Do you think you'll be able to get me feedback on that, X number of days later, right? It's, how strong is your sort of internal review team for your application? Next question is, how do you plan to incorporate that feedback? What are you going to do once you actually get all that feedback? What do you need to do to consider what those internal critiques are and what might need to be done to respond to those before it actually goes in for formal peer review, right? All of these questions can help you figure out what you need to do and what you need to prepare for to actually use your time well when you're writing your grant. So again, it really does depend on you, the individual, how long it takes to write your R01. And it does get faster every time you do it. It gets faster for every grant every time you do it. But just remember, when you're just starting out, especially with a new mechanism and one that is as complex as an R01, you really do need to consider what you have going for you, what might help speed things up or slow you down. But the number one thing I want you to think about is, how much protected time do I have in a given week to do this work? And knowing that, assuming that is a constant, how long would that take me, given the number of hours that I am assuming or guessing that this might take, right? That is a pretty good place to start. And again, the only way you'll really know for sure is to keep track. But think about the hours that you have available, how you're going to use them, and make sure that you have a good purpose for each of those blocks of time that you have for writing, and see how far it gets you. All right, that is it for today. If you found this helpful, I strongly encourage you to sign up for our free resource library. We have lots of tools and resources in there to help you write a stronger NIH grant. See you next time.